I'm Heidi Kmuir, the President of the Foreign Correspondents Association, and I'm very pleased to welcome today the Prime Minister to address the FCA. There is, of course, no need to introduce her to you, but please let me just make a few remarks. These are particularly interesting times in Australian politics, and I'm sure many of you have spent long hours recently when the latest drama in Canberra evolved, even more as it wasn't the only news on that day that was worth reporting on. While the elections will keep us all busy in the months to come, and we may get to know the western suburbs of Sydney a bit better, there was not long ago another headline from Australia that made its way around the world. And it was all about the economy. The headline was 21 years of uninterrupted growth. So I might say, while the rudeness of Australian politics seems, at least to me, quite unique in the civilised world, the Australian economy has stunned the world with its resilience. Now, when it comes to the economy, you must be aware, Prime Minister, that you speak today to a bunch of people with vested interests. Because many of us are paid in a foreign currency, we just want to see one movement of the Australian dollar, and that is down. However, the fact that my mother spent a part of her modest savings to buy Australian dollars after having read some of my articles, I reckon I dealt with this conflict of interest more or less properly. This said, there are right now quite big challenges ahead for the Australian economy. What comes after the mining boom? What is the future of manufacturing in Australia? Will Australia benefit from the dynamics in the Asian region, from China particularly, beyond the mining boom? What policies are needed to keep the economy competitive and people employed? So we are now looking forward to getting some answers from the Prime Minister. Please welcome with me Julia Gillard.
Thank you very much. Can I start by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land on which we meet, and in a spirit of reconciliation paying my respects to elders past and present. Can I thank Heidi for that very warm welcome. I am going to speak about the strength of the Australian dollar, and Heidi, I can't make you that promise about it going down. In fact, my speech will be talking about sustained strength in the Australian dollar. Can I acknowledge Robert, your Vice President too, and Roger, your former President, and to all the association's members. It's good to be able to join you here today. I've received a very warm welcome, which after a fairly rough plane flight in was very much well received. And I look forward to talking to you, knowing the great work that you do interpreting what is happening in our nation to the world. 2013 is a decisive year for our nation. So today I want to speak to you about two things: the facts and the future, where we are and where we need to be. First, the facts. We have more jobs and stronger growth than any of our peers in any of the major developed nations. Over 900,000 jobs created since we came to office, while millions have been added to jobless queues around the world. Unemployment at 5.4%, less than half the rate in Europe at 12%. We have lower interest rates than we've had since 1996. They are much lower than when Labor came to government, saving the average family around $100 a week. We have the highest median wealth in the world. That is, we're not just good at creating wealth, we're also good at sharing it. We have low inflation. Annual underlying inflation has been at or under 2.4% for the whole of the last year, the first time this has happened since 1999. We have a AAA credit rating. By that I mean we are for the first time ever AAA rated with a stable outlook by all three major ratings agencies. We have joined a very exclusive club with only 7 other countries as members. The fact the club is so exclusive proves the difficulty of being AAA rated. We have, as Heidi has referred to, a strong record of economic growth. We're now the 12th biggest economy in the world, up from the 15th biggest when we came to office. Over the same period, our economy has grown more than 5 times faster than Germany and the United States. And even on productivity and industrial disputation, which have seen more barrels of ink spilled and trees felled than any other economic topic, the facts tell their own story. Labor productivity growth for the market sector through the year to December 2012 is significantly above its 10-year average annual growth rate. Industrial disputes are on average about 1/3 of the rate under the previous government, which included the draconian work choices regime. Enterprise bargaining is doing its job, and as a result there hasn't even been a whiff of a wages breakout from the mining sector into the wider economy, like there was in the last mining boom of the early 1980s. Friends, it's hard to reconcile this Australia with either the economic cringe which discounts our national economic achievements or the political negativity which denies them. I know foreign correspondents and your home bureaus aren't strangers to this conundrum. It seems hardly a week passes when a respected overseas journal or international organisation doesn't point out Australia's good fortune and puzzle over our fractious politics. The UN Human Development Index puts Australia in second place. The OECD Better Life Index puts us first. The Economist recently ranked countries according to the best place to be born, and Australia came second after Switzerland, up from 18th place in 1988. The UK Guardian recently noted that, and I quote, "As the world lurches from crisis to economic crisis, the land of Oz is powering ahead." And even the stern Conservatives at the Heritage Foundation have praised our impressive economic resilience. I don't mean that our nation should be boastful. Things can always be improved, and improving them is my mission, my driving purpose. But all Australians are entitled to be quietly proud of what we have achieved together. In a loud and clamorous political marketplace where bad news sells and crazy fear campaigns abound, the facts don't always get to speak for themselves, and so I am here to speak for them so that the facts of our economy are known. In the nature of politics, no one has entirely clean hands, and we can all do more to lift the standard of debate. But make no mistake, ignoring the facts is not just an insult to the quality of political debate, it is an insult to the Australian people, because those facts are the result of hard work and unremitting reform by the Australian community. So my first point today is to urge everyone involved in the political process, elected leaders, commentators, business and civil society, to argue on the facts. Anything less is a disservice to our people and our democracy. Friends, a consideration of the facts then takes us to the future that in so many ways will be decided on the 14th of September. One thing this will not be a contest about is some lost golden age. This is not a time for cosy bedtime stories. There should be no false nostalgia for the days that preceded the global financial crisis, the days when our household savings ratio hit zero, when easy credit and rapidly rising terms of trade created a sugar hit that could never be sustained. Even then, with rivers of gold flowing into federal coffers, a priceless opportunity was squandered. Taxation receipts as a share of GDP were higher in the entire period between 2002-3 and 2007-8 than in every year since and every year before, bar one. Had the Howard government collected the same amount of revenue as a unit of GDP as we currently do, the last 7 years of the Howard government would have been in deficit. But rather than invest in the future, this revenue was spent on quick fixes, at the same time bequeathing a legacy of declining productivity, rising inflation and skills shortages. These are not days we want to bring back. We can only become a stronger nation, a nation of prosperity for all, if we correctly diagnose today's challenges and enable our nation to seize tomorrow's opportunities. This means we must document and explain our plans for the future at a level of detail and financial costing which honours the intelligence of Australian voters. Bluff and bravado may have served our opponents well to date, but they are no answer now. No answer this close to an election. No answer now the carbon pricing fear campaign has been exposed as nonsense. No answer now that my side of politics has resolved its leadership debate. Now the times demand better. The times require deeper thought about the nature of our economic growth today and our economic opportunity tomorrow. Friends, our economic growth today is creating jobs, but that growth has not been generating government revenue in the way in which it has in the past. Most federal taxes are aligned with nominal GDP, the actual dollar price we receive for our exports and our economic production. But unusually, nominal GDP is growing more slowly than real GDP, simply because while production volumes have continued to grow, the prices they command have moderated. This unusual divergence between nominal and real GDP growth has happened only a handful of times in the half-century since the Bureau of Statistics began producing quarterly national accounts. It means government revenues are lower than our experts reasonably predicted them to be. This revenue challenge puts an even greater focus on the need to ensure that future budget expenditure is matched with responsible and targeted savings. This is the discipline with which we all must live. Every politician, every commentator, every advocacy group. This discipline should not be obscured by a false debate about debt and deficit. Our net debt is at 10% of GDP, the equivalent of a person earning $100,000 a year having a mortgage of $10,000. To keep this in perspective, our net debt as a percentage of GDP is around 1/10 of the expected peak across major advanced economies. This net debt is obviously manageable and exists, not because of ongoing expenditure decisions, but because of the huge revenue hit we've seen due to the GFC and the unusual global economic conditions we've seen since. Anyone who pretends this debt should not exist is effectively denying the GFC happened. Anyone who pretends the GFC didn't happen should be treated as the same kind of amusing curiosity as those who believe the earth is flat. Certainly it is impossible for such a person to play any role in the hard decision-making necessary in our nation's life. Similarly, it is impossible for any person of reason to deny the revenue effects associated with today's particular economic circumstances. As a government, we will show through our May budget our continued focus on fiscal discipline. As a government, we will also continue to describe and prepare for what we have called the Asian century. Friends, the economic order of the world is changing. In turn, the strategic order of the world is changing, and we are on the front line of the challenges and opportunities that those changes bring. By 2030, there will be more than 3 billion middle-class consumers in the region to our north. Thanks to the relationships and capabilities we've built over 4 decades, Australia is pushing on an open door as we enter the Asian century. But once we enter, Everything that follows depends on our skill and ingenuity. Nothing is guaranteed to us. Success is not preordained. Asia has the wealth and the demand. Whether we meet that demand is entirely up to us. And let's not imagine that we have the field to ourselves. Europe and the Americas are eyeing the same opportunities as we are, as are Asian countries. They are selling more goods and services to each other than ever before. The Asian century will also involve difficult adjustments, and the high dollar is a clear example of this. It's painful to many sectors, but like Germany under the towering Deutschmark in the days before the euro, a high currency need not be a barrier to making products and services of such quality that our partners still want to buy them. The sustained strength of our dollar is now a feature of the economic landscape. On a trade-weighted basis, it recently rose to the highest level since 1985, and it may persist for some time, given Australia's status increasingly as something of a safe haven currency. Australian dollar to US dollar exchanges are now estimated to be the 5th highest traded currencies in the world. While the high dollar has put significant competitive pressure on many industries, the answer to this is not low wages in a high-skill, advanced economy. It should never be. It takes a more sophisticated approach, policy-rich, detailed, comprehensive. That's why my government has a plan for Australian jobs which has just those features. A plan that means we will be seizing the opportunity in our region as well as the opportunities at home. It's a plan to make sure that we have many diverse sources of strength in our economy. The next election must be a referendum on policy. It must be a test of who has a blueprint for our nation's future in this Asian century. And it is only Labor that has that plan. A plan for the future that rests upon 5 pillars that I've described many times before. First, skills and education. It's not only about uplifting the horizons of each individual. Independent modelling in 2010 showed that our reforms provide an overall benefit to the national economy of around $4,000 per person. Benefits for individuals in education and skills, but tremendous benefits for our whole nation. We cannot win prosperity or create opportunity in this Asian century if our reforms to education are stopped. High-speed broadband for all Australians. Each 10 percentage point increase in broadband penetration is estimated to add about $20 billion to Australia's GDP. Without fibre to the premises, a vision only Labor will realise, we will be left in the horse and buggy lane while other nations zoom past us in Formula One cars. Clean energy and innovation. In the first 6 months since our carbon price was implemented, electricity emissions went down by 8.6% compared to the same period the previous year. We are reducing carbon pollution. In addition, the volume of energy from renewable sources increased by almost 30%, creating new jobs and helping to save the planet along the way. Our nation can't afford the costs of trying to repeal carbon pricing. Competition and deregulation. A Productivity Commission analysis of 17 of our seamless national economy reforms estimated that business costs would be cut by $4 billion a year. Our energy market reforms, announced last December, will alleviate the burden of future household electricity bills by around $250 a year. This major reform cannot be delivered if the problem the reform is directed at is denied. And then tax reform. We've increased by 6.5 times the tax write-off that small businesses get on new asset purchases, an investment injection of nearly $1 billion into the job-creating sector of our economy. We've delivered 3 rounds of tax cuts, and we've tripled the tax-free threshold so that 1 million people no longer lodge any tax return at all. This means that a worker on $50,000 is paying $2,000 less in tax than they did in 2007. Small businesses and families can't afford the tax hikes being promised by the other side of politics. These are the 5 pillars this government has identified as key to increasing jobs, prosperity and productivity. These support our plan for Australian jobs, a plan to back Australian firms to win more work at home so that large projects will need to engage in Australian industry participation plans, creating new local jobs on existing projects. A plan to support Australian industry to increase exports and win new business abroad. A plan to invest in up to 10 industry innovation precincts, which will bring together researchers, innovators, sources of new knowledge and link them with businesses, transforming this new knowledge into new products, new ways of doing things, seizing innovation, creating the jobs of the future. A plan to grow small businesses, creating new mid-sized businesses and helping them to access and prosper on world markets. This is a serious plan for our nation, a serious plan for our future. That's what I meant when I said at the Press Club back in January that we needed to put policies and plans back at the centre of our national discourse. The time to do that is here. This is how Labor always governs. This is the modern Labor model, doing the things needed for a mature, high-wage economy to succeed in a dynamic, emerging region like Asia, competing on skills and quality, playing to our strengths, diversifying our economic base, building a culture of innovation, and perhaps most importantly, leveraging our relationships with Asia as the region grows and rises. Friends, it's no accident that tomorrow I will leave for a visit to China, a visit long planned and prepared for. It's my second visit to China and follows my many visits to the key nations in our region: India, Japan, Indonesia, Korea, Malaysia, Vietnam, Singapore. Approximately 40 years ago, the first Australian Prime Minister visited the People's Republic. So 2013 is a great year for this visit, and I will be leading the most senior Australian political delegation ever to visit China. I will be among the first Western leaders to meet the new leadership. I will be promoting our trade and economic interests and sharing perspectives on global and regional economic and security challenges. But I'm not just going to celebrate our existing strong relationship and its underpinnings, but to look ahead to how we can build the comprehensive relationship envisaged in our Australia in the Asian Century White Paper, including how leaders can help deliver a relationship of greater depth and durability in a more complex future. The timing of this visit so soon after the new leadership has entered into office is deliberate and reflects the importance of our rapidly evolving relationship with China and our high-level political oversight of that relationship. And more broadly, it reflects the centrality of Asia in the story of our nation in the 21st century. Friends, nothing in our destiny as a nation is certain. We saw that a decade ago when the mining boom hit and the then government had no plan for skills, no plan for infrastructure and no plan for broadband. I will not leave our nation similarly unprepared, and as a result, we will win in this Asian century. I thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Prime Minister. I may kick off the Q&A session with the first question. You mentioned several of the economic indicators of the Australian economy. Well, there is this 21 years of constant growth, relatively low unemployment rate, very low public debt level. There are, as always, several factors that led to this success, and I guess there was also some luck in it. But I'd like to focus on one factor that Australia can influence, and that is population growth, mainly fueled by immigration. And so I'm wondering what you think, how dependent the Australian economy is on future population growth and thus immigration. And I guess you also have some idea of how big Australia can get.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you for that first question. We are, of course, a nation of migrants, and we very successfully managed a very, very sizable post-war migration program. I am one of the products of that post-war migration program, and if we took a walk down any of the streets of Sydney today, we would meet so many other Australians whose family story is about migrating here either in recent years or the earlier generation of their family migrating in the post-Second World War period. So we will continue in the years to come, in my view, to be a nation that welcomes migrants and particularly welcomes skilled migrants, and we continue to operate quite a sizable immigration program. We have put the focus on skilled migration, and I think that that is appropriate. It's appropriate for our economic needs, and our focus too is on permanent migration, on having people come to Australia and join our nation. We have very good rates of having people come, become permanent residents and then become citizens. And I think one of the ways in which we offer citizenship, the citizenship ceremonies we have around the country, are a special way that we mark the entry of people into being full members of the Australian nation. So we will continue to see immigration. It will be important to our economic growth. It won't, of course, be the dominant part of our economic growth. We will have an economy with many sources of strength, but migration will still play a role. In terms of estimating population numbers for the future, I'm not one that says you need to set a target. I think what you've got to do is manage your migration program in line with your nation's needs, which means that there will always be some year-by-year adjustments. What I've always thought was important was to have a sense of settlement patterns, and one of the things that I think particularly the NBN will do, and the focus we've brought to regional Australia, is we will see more diffuse settlement patterns than we have in the past, where overwhelmingly migrants have come to our biggest cities, and indeed for some migrant groups they've overwhelmingly settled in one part of those cities.
Australia's strategic position in the triangle China, US and Australia. You have allowed US Marines to be stationed in Darwin. More Marines are coming to Australia. Will that be a big part of your discussion in China? I know China looked quite critically at that situation last year. Will that be important in the view of the North Korean tensions as well at the moment?
Well, the stationing of the Marines in Darwin is not news, certainly not news to China, and I've attended international meetings with Chinese leaders since that announcement was made. Indeed, I've attended a number of them. I don't view us as being in a position where the strong relationship we have with China, the strong and growing relationship we have with China, is somehow in contest or in contrast to the relationship we have with the United States of America, where we have both the bonds of history and today's friendship and our outlook for the future. I think to put Australia in that position misunderstands our position, but I think it actually misdiagnoses the nature of the relationship between the US and China. And one would say for very different nations with very different cultural outlooks and very different political systems, that the US and China have shown the maturity to manage their relationship and manage it well. Inevitably, there is some strategic competition, but overwhelmingly, this relationship between the US and China has been managed well, and my view is that it will continue to be managed well in the future. In those circumstances, for us, we will continue to do what we've done for some period of time, to tend to our friendship and alliance with the United States, whilst growing our relationship with China. On the deployment of the Marines in Darwin, this is a decision that I took as part of taking a new step forward in our ongoing alliance with America. We made sure that we briefed our regional partners about it. Overwhelmingly, it was well received in our region of the world. People do understand that having those Marines there means that we can engage in joint exercising and work on things like humanitarian relief, and all too often in our region we are called to each other's aid for humanitarian relief. So I think the perspective on those Marines is not as dramatic as sometimes the media reporting would lead you to believe. We're talking about exercising for 6 months of the year in what is a good environment to exercise in. That it's a very hard environment, so when you're trying to breed up very tough Marines, it's a good place to go exercising, and so it suits the United States, and we were happy to accommodate them. Ask the next question again today.
You have talked about deepening the relationship with Asia, and Japan has expressed to enter the TPP and going to strengthen the tie with United States and Australia and other Asian countries. And how do you relate your policy towards China and TPP negotiations, as Australia hasn't given consent to Japanese entry to the negotiation? And what would be the obstacle for you to, yes?
Sure. Look, we are involved in a wide range of trade discussions, and we take the view that we would have liked to have seen more progress in the Doha round, in the global trade discussions. Our Minister for Trade, in an intrepid and determined way, continues to press for that. But of course there have been some major obstacles with pressing the Doha round to conclusion. We therefore pursue trade talks in a variety of multilateral and bilateral settings. We continue to have discussions with Japan about a bilateral FTA. We continue to have discussions with China about a bilateral FTA. We have signalled that we want to be involved in the Trans-Pacific Partnership, and we are involved in those discussions. We've welcomed the expression of interest from Japan. We think that this has to be an ambitious, high-level agreement, so we want to see every nation that expresses a wish to join meeting that aspiration of an ambitious, high-level agreement. And if Japan is entering these talks with that aspiration, then we will be very welcoming of Japan's involvement. Of course, this is something that needs to get the consent of all TPP countries in the same way that the entry of Canada and Mexico required that consent.
Thank you. The next question is Hiroki Chima.
Thank you, Prime Minister. The Japanese Prime Minister Shinzo Abe recently reviewed his views on national security in East Asia. He said that Japanese need to be part of the democratic security diamond, which is Australia, India, and Japan, and the United States, Hawaii, and form a diamond shape of the security cooperation that can contain China's military expansion in the region. So what do you think of this idea? And have you discussed it with Mr. Abe? And also, there are some ongoing dispute between China and Japan, and such as a territorial row over a group of islands, small islands in East China Sea. Are you going to discuss this particular issue with President Xi Jinping and now while you're at the Beijing? Thank
Thank you for the question. I have had the opportunity to speak to Prime Minister Abe by telephone and to congratulate him on his election, and we did, briefly, as you can in a telephone call, canvass a range of matters, and the strength of our friendship with Japan is of long standing. And certainly as Prime Minister I've sought to nurture that, and I think the fact I was the first foreign leader to visit Japan after the devastating tsunami was noted in Japan. Certainly an amazing experience for me to see the stoicism and bravery of the Japanese people in those circumstances, and I was pleased that a visit at that time was so welcomed when, of course, there was so much concern about the people of Japan, but also about the aftermath of the nuclear incident, that by being physically present I could show that it was possible for people to visit Japan, and that I was more than happy to do so. On security perspectives, we do not believe in a containment policy in relation to China. That is not our outlook. That is not the outlook of the United States of America. What we want to see is a prosperous China, increasingly engaged in our region and in the world. We think that that is good for China, it's good for the region, it's good for the world. We have a dialogue with China on security questions, military-to-military dialogue, and of course we have ongoing defence dialogues with Japan as well. And so we will continue to nurture both of those very important relationships to us. On tensions, the tensions that there have been around the islands, or the tensions involving Japan and China, our view is that peace and security in North Asia is pivotal to all of us. It's pivotal to Australia. Not only do we have big economic ties to China and Japan, and of course to other parts of North Asia. We've literally got tens of thousands of Australians who live in that part of the world. So peace and security in North Asia is of pivotal importance to us. We don't take a view on the contending territorial claims, but we do, and in all of our dialogues we will advocate for peaceful resolution and for the work of diplomacy to ease these tensions.
Next question is from Andrew Jones, Al Jazeera.
I'd like to ask a question, slightly changing tack, on Fiji. The Australian government seems to have been relatively quiet on the dumping of a constitution drawn up by an independent expert in favour of one written by the Prime Minister and his Attorney General, unelected military ruler, arguably. What is Australia's position on this new constitution, under which some people say a constitutional coup has gone on and no free and fair election could ever be held? And is Australia's sway in that part of the world waning a little as China ups its investment right across the Pacific?
On the constitution, we understand that there were some civil society concerns about the draft of the constitution. That's a dialogue for the people of Fiji to have, though of course the way in which the constitution was discarded was concerning to us, but we did understand that there were civil society concerns with its contents. For us, we continue on Fiji to have the same outlook that we've had for a long period of time, which is that we must see a return to free and fair elections, and we stand ready to assist with preparations for those elections, for the conduct of those elections. We believe that Commodore Bainimarama needs to be held to his promises and accountabilities about having those elections, and that they need to be held on time and properly done. So we will continue to press for that and to raise our voice in forums, including the Pacific Island Forum, on those matters. In terms of China's engagement in the Pacific, as China's role, China's weight and power continues to rise, then of course it will have a stronger and more diverse relationships around the world, including in the Pacific. We want to see countries around the world working for aid and development in the Pacific. There is a lot to be done. We believe that that aid and development money needs to be the subject of proper accountabilities and transparencies so people can see the work that is being done. So once again, we think that there are ways of working together in the Pacific to see much needed economic development, and we believe our focus has to stay on seeing a return to true democracy in Fiji.
Thank you, Prime Minister. Thank you very much for coming to us. We have just realized that you are the first serving Prime Minister since Bob Hawke talking to us. So this is a truly historical moment. Prime Minister, in your past career you had a reputation as being a compassionate lawyer with a high level of empathy and humanity. These days you govern over what some describe as one of the harshest and most inhumane asylum seeker policies in the Western world. Looking at your current political situation, one could say that you were at best moderately successful in appealing to the racists in the suburbs of Australia and to those people who believe what's actually written in the Daily Telegraph. But one could argue that you certainly that with your policy of being even tougher than John Howard, that you certainly alienated even your staunchest supporters on the more progressive side of politics. In retrospect, do you think that was a smart strategy, a smart move?
The only thing that our asylum seeker and refugee policies are about is deterring people from risking their lives by getting on boats, combating people smuggling, which is a transnational crime, trying to profit on human need and human misery in the same way in which the international drug trade seeks to profit from human misery, in the same way in which human trafficking seeks to profit from human misery, and honouring our obligations under the Refugee Convention, of which we are a proud signatory. So these are the things that drive our policy settings: the Refugee Convention, stopping people getting on boats and risking their lives, combating a transnational crime. This is not an easy policy area, and if one looks around the world, whether you turn your eyes towards Europe or whether you turn your eyes towards Canada or other countries, you see nation-states struggling to work out the best set of policies in asylum seeker and refugee policy area. And I think that's because there are contending considerations. People want to be compassionate. We are a very compassionate country. We settle large numbers of refugees. Per head of population, we settle them in extraordinarily large numbers. So we can very much hold our heads up high in the world as a compassionate country. But we don't want to see anything in our domestic policies which would facilitate bad people making money or cause people to believe that they will get a better future if they risk their lives on a boat. And for all of us in Australia, including some of our nation's most progressive elements, I think that there's been a recognition about the real dangers and real tragedies that come when people do get on boats. So in those circumstances, we turn to the best experts for advice, to a former head of our Defence Force, to a foreign policy expert, to a refugee expert, and we said as a government we would enact their policies in full. And when you strip their policies right down to their underlying essence, it is that you should get no advantage for having paid a people smuggler and having got on a boat. And I think that is a compassionate underpinning. I think it's morally right. I think it's practically right to say that you should not give people an advantage because they've got on a boat. So that is how we're operating our policy now. I think that stands very well alongside Australian values and Labor Party values. We've been stopped from enacting some of it by the cycle of negativity in Australian politics, but I think the report we received was good advice and the right policy way forward, and that's why we're determined to keep trying to implement it all.
Next question, Brian, BBC.
Prime Minister, I'll ask a follow-up on that. Australia is getting a very good international press at the moment, but this issue around boat people gets you a very negative press. Reputational damage is being done to Australia. And the national debate seems to be very ugly at times. You hear it on Talkback Radio, you hear it on the streets when you go out and vox pop people. Do you take a measure of responsibility for that? For when you said at the Lowy Institute in 2010 that political correctness should not constrain this debate?
I think if you walked out on the streets of London and asked people what they've thought about the various waves of asylum seekers coming through into the UK, you've seen numbers of Albanians and people of other ethnicities come through into the UK. I think if you stood and vox popped on the streets of London, if you did it in France, if you did it in much of Europe, you would get a variety of views expressed, some of them quite harsh views about the people who are seeking asylum. I think that is the nature of the debate in democracies about refugee and asylum seeker issues. So I don't think that that is an Australian phenomenon. I just don't. Well, what leaders can do, and what I have always done in this area, is not focus on or seek to demonise the people who are looking for asylum, but to deal with the policy principles. And the policy principles are, I think, very clear. You should not get an advantage from having engaged in forward movement and forward movement. It is not right or defensible that someone who can pay a people smuggler gets an advantage over a person who cannot pay a people smuggler. Now, to get those policy settings right, in our near neighbours, whether it's Indonesia or Malaysia, there are many people with legitimate refugee claims. We have made available more places because we do think people with legitimate refugee claims should find a resettlement opportunity in the world, and Australia can step forward and offer more of those resettlement opportunities. But we don't want there to be any level of encouragement for people to get on boats.
New York Times.
Prime Minister, when you took the very unusual step of announcing the elections nearly 8 months before the poll date, you promised at the time not to test Australians' patience in 2013 after a bruising 2012, and, quote, you said that the elections would, this cycle would give shape and order to the year rather than devolving into constant campaigning. Firstly, do you feel that you and your government have lived up to those promises? And in light of what's gone on since that announcement, do you feel that it was a mistake to announce the elections so early?
No, I don't. I think it was important that Australians knew what the shape of this year would be. People, when they're thinking about these issues, often don't, in my view, correctly wargame what the alternative would be. The alternative to us having fixed the election date, in my view, would have been fevered speculation day after day about when the election was going to be, with shrill calls every second day for the election to be now. I think I would have found it quite hard to, jump in a car and go to work without people chasing me down the street to see whether or not I was going to the Governor-General's. So we would have seen pages and pages of newspaper coverage, hours and hours and hours of TV and radio time devoted to what ultimately is a futile pursuit, which is trying to predict the election date. We've cleared that out of the way. What I want to fill the space is what I've talked about today and what I've talked about in January, which is the genuine contest of policy that the election in September should be about. Who has got the better blueprint for this nation's future, who's got the best personal capacity to deliver that blueprint for the nation's future. That should be what the contest is about. Now, I freely admit that some of the space that was vacated because it wasn't full of election coverage has been filled with other unproductive things. I very frankly said that my political party put in an appalling performance in the last sitting fortnight, and unfortunately that took a lot of space. But as I've said in this speech, now we are beyond that leadership debate. Now we are beyond the crazy nonsense people have had to listen to in the anti-carbon pricing campaign. Now we've got the time between here and the election day to have that genuine policy dialogue. As that time works through, I will be doing what I need to do properly as Prime Minister. I will go to China tomorrow. I will come back from China and endeavour to wrangle premiers and chief ministers into important positions about the long-term future of education in our country at the Commonwealth Heads of Government meeting. We are preparing a budget. We are preparing a budget in difficult circumstances in terms of the revenue challenge, but we are doing that with our eyes firmly on the capacities our nation will need to seize the best of opportunities for the future. So that's how I should be using the time. That's how I will use the time.
Next question is
Prime Minister, some of the Australian media and some of your parliamentary colleagues, to me, seem to be extremely or incredibly hostile to you as a person when I watch the discussions. How much do you think of this is based on misogyny?
I don't know whether you can deal with that in generalisation. I'm not sure that you can. I've been very clear as Prime Minister that when I see old-fashioned attitudes, closed-minded attitudes, when I see sexism, when I see misogyny, I'll be very clear about calling it out and naming it for what it is. I think what I would say about being the first woman to do this job is a broader point, which is it's not been ever the norm in our nation before for people to wake up in the morning and look at the news and see a female leader doing this job. For all of the years before, you would see a man in a suit. I am not a man in a suit. And I think that that has taken the nation some time to get used to. I think it's probably still taking the nation a bit of time to get used to. I think it's the same sort of journey that many other nations around the world are on, and it speaks really to the changing nature of our times and you know, the forward progress for women in societies like ours. But it's got some uncomfortable moments along the way, there's no doubt about that. And I feel one of the things that will certainly happen, having had the first female Prime Minister, is it's going to be easier for the second, and then it's going to be easier again for the third, and then everybody will get over it and forget about it, and no one will even bother to comment anymore whether the images of leadership in our nation that particular year are images of female leadership or male leadership.
Prime Minister, my question is about the energy trade between Australia and China. Australia is regarded as a stable supplier of LNG, for example, and steaming coal. The global supply situation is evolving. For example, the United States will possibly be an LNG supplier from 2015 into the Asian market. And in Russia, for example, the first visit by President Xi overseas was to Russia, where he oversaw the signing of some strategic, what they call breakthrough energy agreements between the Russian oil and gas companies and their Chinese counterparts. Given that context, are you concerned about the competitive threat posed to Australian LNG exports, and is greater energy cooperation on your agenda in China?
It's a competitive world, and you're right. The amount of competition in the energy sector is getting stronger and stronger, more and more acute. So what that means is that you've got to be very good at what you do. I am very confident that we can be very good at what we do. I think we're very good now, and we are always going to have to look for the innovations that make us an even better quality supplier. One of the things that I think in images of mining, if you ask people their images of mining, I think there would be two common misunderstandings people would make about the Australian mining situation. Number one, people would tend to think it's a far bigger share of our economy. People would think it's sort of, 30% or 40% of employment. Of course it's not. Mining is, employment-wise, a smaller share of our economy, obviously a big share of our exports. So we are a diversified economy, but mining is going to continue to be important to us. The other image issue I think people would get wrong is they'd get an old-fashioned image about, men in hard hats and blasts and dirt and all the rest of it. Of course, some of those images hold true today, but people would underestimate the degree of technological innovation that has revolutionised mining. That you can have someone staring at a computer screen in Perth controlling a huge piece of equipment in the northwest. What that is, you can always get better and better and better at what you do, and that is going to be the challenge for us. Competitive in what is going to be, I think, an increasingly contested and crowded marketplace. Certainly, whenever I go overseas, one of the topics we talk about is energy and our status, really given the size of our country as an energy superpower.
Next question is from George Young, Phoenix TV, Hong Kong.
Hi, Prime Minister. As you said, there are your speech saying the Australian dollar high will be becoming a problem Australia trade into the Asia or into the globe. Obviously, we believe the Australian published you are going to Shanghai on 8th of April to sign agreement between China and Australia currency agreement. And we heard about that agreement has been postponed. Would you please confirm with me?
There was a story in the Australian newspaper, that's true, speculating about what I may or may not do when I'm in Shanghai. I know I'm going to give the answer that frustrates journalists more than any other, and that answer is you are going to have to wait till I'm in Shanghai.
Last question is from Steve Marshall, TV New Zealand.
Thank you, Heidi. Prime Minister, a lot of the jobs that Labor's created have been taken up by New Zealanders, yet they still complain that they're being treated like second-class citizens here because of certain rules that were changed in 2001, which I'm sure you're across. In your eyes, what contribution do New Zealanders make to the Australian economy? And secondly, what's stopping repealing that legislation that John Howard introduced in 2001?
Our relationship with New Zealand is one of family. It's Anzac for a reason, and that does tell you something about our relationship with New Zealand. And as a result, because of the relationship between Australia and New Zealand, New Zealanders have more access, better access to the Australian labour market and better access to Australian benefits and supports than any other nationality. That will continue for the future, but unfortunately the answer to your question is we've got no plans to extend it for the future. These are issues that continue to be the subject of discussion between us and New Zealand, but I'm not in a position to say we've got any immediate plans for change. We think the benefits that are provided do support New Zealand people in Australia. There were some issues when former Prime Minister John Howard and former Prime Minister Helen Clark entered into that agreement. We think many of those issues would still be relevant to considerations about repealing that agreement and repealing that legislation. So I've had this conversation many times with Prime Minister Key, and I'll see him again. Actually, he will be at the Boao Forum too, so I'll have the opportunity to say hello to him there, and I'm sure he will continue the case for change. But I'm not in a position to say that we are going to move on that area.
Would you agree that New Zealanders contribute more to the economy than basic trade and social security?
Well, certainly, New Zealanders, the New Zealand contribution to the Australian economy, it's individuals who come here, who work hard, who build much of their lives here. Many of them do go on to become Australian citizens, not always. Many of them stay as permanent residents and then take the opportunity to go back and forth a fair bit. There's a huge contribution from New Zealanders into our economy, and there's a huge benefit bestowed by Australia on New Zealanders by giving them that preferential access to our labour market and to our social security system.
Okay, we have to leave it there. Thank you very much again, Prime Minister. Thank you.